I'm going to use my cheat sheet. I don't like to do this, but I want to make sure I get everybody's name right. So I'm going to start from the end. And at the end, we've got Sébastien Bazin, CEO of AccorHotels. Nigel Vaz, Chief Strategist at SapientNitro. Greg Cudahy, with an extra A that isn't visible, just to make things complicated. Pierre Gore-Coty, who is famous in France, I think, at this time, and but we love having him here. And lastly, Javier Moreno from El País, or Grupo PRISA. And we're going to just really we're going to try to end this day with a free-flowing conversation about the intersection between old and new and large and big and incumbent and disruptive and every which way we can. So have a great time, guys. Enjoy it. Thank you.
Spencer, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you to you all for being here on a Friday afternoon in Paris at the last session. So I will take that as a sign of commitment. When I read the title of this roundtable, The Economy of Now Coming to Terms with Ubernomics, I couldn't help thinking of these well-known 5 stages of mourning you all know. The first is denial, the second is anger, the third is bargaining, depression, and acceptance. We've seen denial. I think we're past that point. We've seen anger, not least here in Paris with the taxi drivers, who, by the way, wouldn't accept your credit card back then, or wouldn't take you aboard if you were not heading in the right direction. And we're right now somewhere between bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But to start first, what's Ubernomics? I mean, I believe it's not just on-demand mobile service companies on the rise, on a huge rise, actually. I believe it's a sign of something much, much bigger, a harbinger of profound turn in the way the global economy is organized, is arranged, and the consequences of which are already being felt in many, many fields. I read somewhere, and I'm going to read that to you, that Ubernomics is about empowering, not exploiting stakeholders, and changing from a mindset of scarcity to a mindset of abundance. Would you agree with that, Pierre?
Hello, everyone. It's a difficult question. I didn't know the term Ubernomics before, but I think it's always a good sign when a company's name becomes a common word. What I would say is Uber was born 6 years ago in San Francisco, and at the time, we had absolutely no idea that all what has happened since then would happen. It was just about creating an app that would let you push a button and get a ride. And as we did so, I think we realized that there was an opportunity to solve something that was way bigger than simply pushing a button and getting a ride. And that was actually about making mobility and reinventing mobility across cities everywhere in the world. And to give you a bit of context here on a few numbers that sometimes people don't really see because everyone stays focused a lot on the debate and the conflict with taxis. To put a few numbers, I think what we realized is one of the biggest problems when you think about mobility in cities has to do with individual car ownership. And this has a huge public cost. There's 1 billion cars on this planet, which means that you're seeing in every city around the world time being wasted in traffic. In London, for instance, people are wasting 10 hours a week sitting in their car, commuting back and forth. It also has an economic cost. In the EU, for instance, traffic is costing 1% of GDP every year. And there's obviously a cost when it comes to pollution, with 12% of the CO2 emissions coming from cars. Now, this is just 4% of the problem, because 96% of the time, that billion car is actually sitting idle on a parking space. And that means that when I open my window in the morning and I look around, what do I see? I see cars sitting in the street, I see parking spaces. In some cities, you have up to 1/3 of the city space that's dedicated to storing cars. And what we've realized as we grew, as Uber started to deploy its service everywhere, was that there was a huge opportunity for technology to actually solve that. So the first thing when it comes to urban mobility that people think about is, well, isn't the solution actually public transit as opposed to individual cars? And I think that's fair. Now, what we observe is that here in Paris, for instance, which is known for having one of the best public transit systems in the world, you still have 15 million people or 15 million trips in individual cars that are happening every day across the greater Paris area. And the reason is simple. This is happening because public transit is not getting to everyone's doorstep. And this is where I think Uber plays in, and it plays in two ways. The first one is Uber is complementing public transit, and what we've observed is that in many of the cities where we really reach a certain scale, you see people taking Uber and then getting to a train station and then getting to the city center. In London, for instance, 30% of the trips that are happening in the suburbs are actually getting people to or from train stations. So there's this complementary aspect. And then the second aspect is even beyond that, and this is something fairly new that actually we launched almost a year ago, even beyond this idea of complementing public transit, there is the idea to turn private cars into public goods by essentially mutualizing the way people use cars. And this is a service we launched that's called Uber Pool, which today accounts for 20% of Uber trips globally. And the way that works is that as we scaled in San Francisco, for instance, which was our earliest city, we've observed that at any given point in time, there were hundreds of people that were traveling along the same lines and going to the same spot. And this is where we launched that product, which today has been a huge success, which we have in Paris, London, and which we'll bring to other cities.
There is an interesting thread here, Pierre, which is not just about the company, but about changing the whole idea, or the very idea of mobility, of urban mobility. So in that spirit, Sebastian, I would like to ask you, well, how has this Uber revolution, or how is it spilling over to other fields? I mean, you have experience in hotels at the core. So how is this spilling over other fields, this Uber revolution?
Well, I guess the way to summarize it, it's a wake-up call, i.e. you have to understand it with no no fear. It's not a threat. It just pushes you to think differently, to adapt, to probably think whether you should get into that new business, which is basically the sharing economy, which in my field, it's Airbnb. I have good relationship with Airbnb, and I've been saying on many occasions, I wish Accor would have invented Airbnb. So I have nothing against it. We should have been participating into Airbnb like 6 or 7 years ago. So if you understand why people are using it, then you need to understand, is there anything you should be doing differently as a hotel company to adapt, to offer similar pricing, similar experience, uniqueness of being in the heart of a city at somebody else's home, and how to participate, which is why I've been saying for the last couple of years is Accor has been a very good hotel operator for the last 50 years. We are the biggest hotel operator in the world. And I'm saying that a third of my likely revenue 5 years from today is made of services and products I've never done for the last 50 years. And sharing economy is part of it, which is why we decided that on the service content of the luxury space in sharing economy, what you have companies like One Fine Stay, Square Break, Luxury Retreats, we need to invest into those companies. We need to create world leadership. Why? It's because they have a service content attached to it that most of those platforms in the sharing economy, they do not want to provide the service because it basically implies for them a new labor content. And they don't want to have this labor constraint because it's going to be decreasing margins and increasing risk. I have 240,000 people already in 92 countries. So what is it that I should be doing with my existing labor force so that I can participate with the service attached into that field to the benefit of my clients and future clients? So it's not a threat. It's another way, it's another shape of mind. It's probably a new adventure. There is risk associated, but there is skill. So the name of the game is don't wait until somebody create a monopoly. Create it yourself. be the first guy, be ahead of the game, and think client. So whatever we're going to be doing is going to be client first, so that I guess they're going to know through AccorHotel.com, they may end up in my hotels, but they may end up in somebody else's apartments with services and the branded by Accor. It's easy to think. It's tough to execute. The biggest difficulty is not really getting into the field. The biggest difficulty is having to explain to 240,000 people, employees of Accor, why they need to adapt. There's a lot of pedagogy because they understand it, they're not sure how to participate, and I will not do it without them. So how are you going to be embarking 240,000 people doing something different from the past and obviously changing their behavior? It's a cultural gap, but that's fine.
Sebastian, thank you very much. Segueing into this issue of cultural change inside the company, Greg, we were talking about that before. Could you explain how this digital transformation is linked to a cultural change inside the companies?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good build on these things because I think there's a lot of fear out there that it's a culture change that happens too fast. I mean, we see it. You went through the curve, and it's exactly right. But the fact is, companies, in fact, you mentioned your example with Accor right there, when you have parts of your company that are incented to actually find these things and then convert it into the terms that the rest of the workforce can understand to participate as you talk, I think that's a huge thing. I do think that if you look at what's happened, certainly in Silicon Valley lately, the number of companies that are going to IPOs is decreasing versus those that are going into bigger companies. And there's a great partnership happening between large companies and small companies, not out of just some charitable thought, but out of the fact that this is going to happen. And the way to make this happen is to make it happen right for people through the whole value chain. For the people who are there in existing jobs, who may have a different job as they go forward, but also for all the people who have tremendous innovation, who tend to be younger. And how do we make the people with the ideas get more presence in the culture of more standard type of operating firms? There's a lot of unicorns that will be standalone, but the fact is, in terms of the culture, most of the big businesses we work with right now, there are more companies now in the Global 2000 that have their own venture arms and their own change management capability and their own innovation function than than there's ever been. But 5 years ago, hardly any had that. So there's a big change in the culture of trying to be part of this, as was mentioned here, instead of trying to resist it.
Nigel, before we got on stage, we were having a very interesting conversation about platforms, about investing in assets or skills, putting them all together in a platform. How big is this shift, and how are you helping companies? Because, he works at Sapient, which I don't know whether Spencer said that, which is I think it is one of the coolest agencies in the world, and don't take my word for it, just check its website. Could you please elaborate a little bit further on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just given the comments we've had from Sebastian and Pierre and Greg, I think one big shift we're seeing is technology used to be operating businesses and used to be a cost center. So for a CEO, it was the thing that you actually wanted to minimize the cost on. And actually what it's done in every business, it's moved to being about differentiation. So technology today is probably the single biggest differentiator advancing businesses. Mark Andreessen talked very famously about software is eating the world, and I think the bigger idea behind that is this idea of creating value-added services to solve very specific problems that consumers are having through technology can be scaled in a non-linear fashion. So to go from 250,000 people to 500,000 people is going to take a lot of time. But to leverage the economy that's already out there with customers, and obviously Uber does that fantastically, leveraging the driving potential of lots of other people, means you can scale these resources in a non-linear fashion. And I think we're at a stage today where customers' base expectation is everybody is in competition with Uber. It's not just if you're a cab company, or everybody's in competition with Airbnb. Because if I have an experience on one of those companies, chances are I'm measuring the companies I spend my money with by those standards. So I want companies to constantly reimagine themselves. And if you think about the startup space, and there are some big unicorns that everybody talks about, for me, it's about constant disruption. So you look at like a Netflix, started as a mail order DVD business, then evolved to streaming, has now disrupted itself to compete with HBO and produce content. So it's not just you have a great idea and you launch that idea and you move forward, but how do you create this constant iteration? Software, Facebook changes Messenger every week. How does the hotel business evolve every day, every week, every month? How does the airline business evolve? And I think that evolution is probably the single biggest shift that I think the opportunity for businesses is there to take today.
Well, this would be a question for all of you. I mean, how do you see this revolution having an impact on fields which right now feel a little bit away from it? Let's say, how do you think a bank will look like in 5 years or in 10 years? I don't want to add some fear to the current times. I mean, we have...
Well, if they're not careful and they don't evolve their model, they're going to become a safety deposit box. Because all the value-added services in the traditional banking world will evolve to people who are going to create more value for customers. So a lot of our clients are evolving. Why do you have to go into a bank to open a bank account? Why do you need a card to take money out of an ATM machine? These are basic questions, and every time you reimagine one of these, you create a fundamental difference in an organization that could end up being a vault for your money, but the cool stuff is done by a bunch of startups on the outside, or they fundamentally change their businesses.
Sebastian, is there any field of activity free from the I don't know, threats or
Sure there is. I mean, again, there's two things about our industry which is good. There's a lot of bads, but there's two good things. Number one, the hospitality sector, the tourism, travel industry sector, it's a growing sector by a rate of 5% per annum for the last 10 years and very likely to be 5% per annum for the next 10 years. You have a very big visibility on my sector. Second thing, supply and demand. You have a supply of new hotel rooms, which is 2% maximum per annum, against a demand which is 5% per annum, which is why Airbnb exists, because they know there's excess demand versus supply. The other thing in my industry is very unlikely it's going to be dematerialized, i.e. travelers will end up spending time at your mother-in-law, in your camping, at Airbnb, or in a hotel room. But the hotel is still going to be the recipient of many travelers. The name of the game for me is to shift away from being a hospitality-only company to be a travel companion, i.e. my job for the last 50 years has been starting when you enter my hotel room and finishes when you leave my hotel room, which is wrong, wrong, wrong. What I have to do tomorrow is I need to think of you before you leave your home to be of a service provider, travel companion, whether I'm going to be providing you services for your railway, for the airplane, for the car, for the museum, for the restaurants, to have me being top of your mind. Same thing when you return to your home, i.e. a lot of new services which is aggregated, fragmented in probably hundreds of hands, which big companies with network could be one of the sole facilitator in providing that service. So moving away from hospitality only to travel services and obviously data network oriented, because there's a lot of information. And one of the things that I want to say, which is a big difference, all the Airbnb, Uber, Booking, Expedia, they actually never meet the client. It's a digital platform and a damn good one, but they never have any interface with the client. I have an interface which lasts between 24 hours to 72 hours, i.e. I have an occasion to sit down with that client and to ask questions, which is not basically prescript. I get some emotion. That data has a real importance if you know how to use it. So you need to ask the right questions. Want to make sure your client is in a good mood, so he has time to answer your questions. You need to record what he said to you, to make sure it's going to be on a network which is going to be shared. If you tell me something when you're going to be at my hotel in New York, you want to be on the 5th floor away from the lift. If in 1 week you're going to be in Moscow in one of my hotel rooms, I want the guy in Moscow to know that you want to be on the 5th floor away from the lift. Well, so that warm information, if you make good use of it, then you create a fortune.
Yeah, I think there should be fear. And the fact is that fear has a name, and it's called competition. This is just competition much faster than it's been. And I think the fact is that those who adapt to that and can take advantage of these things that they're seeing are going to be the future disruptors. And I speak to some of the entrepreneurs out here. There's all this talk about disruptors, and let's talk about those who are the disruptors today. And in deference to my friend here, there's going to be another round of disruptors. Who they're going to be and how big companies tap into that is the next big thing. I'll remind you that there used to be a thing called first mover advantage. Whoever got it first won. And the big search king of the 90s was a company called Yahoo. Couldn't be disrupted. I think that's been disproved. There's a little company called Google that came out and displaced them. You may remember another thing called MySpace. First mover, dominant. Facebook came along, slightly different position in the market today than MySpace. All great companies, but the ones that came in and disrupted were constantly looking at the future and how they're going to change it, not dominating the current market.
Pierre, you want to add something to that? Because I had a question for you.
First of all, I was just about to agree with what Greg's doing, and I think one of the things I like about my job and about waking up in the morning is not knowing whether I'll still be alive in 6 months or in 2 years. Uber is a company that didn't even exist 5 years from now. And the only other thing I was about to answer to, which was your questions around what is the next thing where you can see technology having some sort of an impact. I was just about to say it's interesting because when I often look back at what's happening in the transport and trying to understand why Uber is successful and what people tend to like the product, and it ticks a number of boxes that are actually interesting. It saves money for people, or it creates economic opportunities for others. It gives time to people, and more than anything, I think there's the on-demand and simplicity aspect, which is extremely powerful. And in every discussion we have with the people that use Uber, the thing they value the most is, I love it because I just press the button and it comes now. And I guarantee that 2 years ago, everyone would ask me, oh, why don't you let me order a car for a week from now so that I don't have to worry about it and so on. So we see a move towards on-demand, which brings me to, for instance, food delivery, where we've launched a product that's called Uber Eats. There's a lot of competitors out there in Europe, and it's definitely a sector that I'm a huge believer in. We see huge traction, and the idea of pressing a button and getting 8 minutes later a hot meal from a restaurant I like is something that I think is very interesting. And in the same way today, I'm telling you, why would you own a car? I'd love that you invite me 5 years from now or 3 years from now, and I'm asking you why you have a kitchen in your flat.
Pierre, no, since you joined Uber 5 years ago, I understand, and back then you were just 100 people. So you've been placed. I mean, you're at the core of this revolution from minute one. So since this is a tidal wave which is going to affect sectors and companies far away from what we're discussing right now, what these places or this you're uniquely placed to give some piece of advice to those companies which still thinks this tidal wave is not going to.
Yes, I think as I said, there's a number of opportunities out there, which is in my opinion incredible. The one thing I would say is I would want to make sure that people in Europe are actually confident about their ability to succeed. A lot of people come to me very often and tell me, oh, should I just go to Silicon Valley? And can we actually do anything in France or in all of those countries? And my answer to that is usually, and I see that every day, the quality of the talent base there is, especially in the engineering world, in Europe, in France specifically, but in many European countries, is incredible. The second engineer we ever hired at Uber was a French guy, and he's still around. We have a number of French engineers there. So I think we have a great quality of talent. What is missing to some extent, or what I wish we could somehow change, is I think there is number one, a regulatory pressure, and of course I say that in the light of Uber, but more broadly speaking, there's a regulatory bureaucracy that exists that is very complex to deal with. And secondly, when you're starting a business in New York or in SF, you have 300 million people to tap into with the same currency, the same language, and the same rules. Whereas for us here in Europe, well, I hardly have a business in Germany when I have a huge business in the UK, when I've just been shut down in XYZ, and there's diversity in regulation that make it very hard to actually plan forward and hire people, raise money, and so on for European entrepreneurs.
Thank you. This is, again, a question for all of you, but I would like to start with Greg and Nigel answering for obvious reasons. Do you think there is any downside to this, Greg? Are you worried about the social impact of these disruptive technologies?
I actually am worried about the social impact significantly, but maybe not in the way that some people might think. I think when you hear worry about the social impact, you say, well, how do we use, to your point, regulation to slow things down? That is actually not what I'm worried about, is how can we slow it down? It's going to move. In a digital economy, things move across borders. Even with the issues of the past week, digitally, electronically, things move across borders now. My worry is not so much how fast the technology will change. My worry is that our entrepreneurs, yes, entrepreneurs are a given. Look out at this floor. There's so much innovation out here, it's unbelievable. How do we unleash it? But in terms of the social impact, how are entrepreneurs working with big business? How are entrepreneurs working with government? But also, how are entrepreneurs working with educators and the consumers themselves? Because what you are doing as entrepreneurs is bringing the consumer into the business. And I think we've got to have all those working together, because things like robotic process automation, which we have not talked about, but those are even shorter term impact on employment. It's a good thing, though, to take people out of jobs that can be repetitive, not tap their creativity. And we have to figure out, working with all those groups, how to take advantage of that. The other thing I'd say is I'm older than most of the entrepreneurs out here this week. So this is my second big tech revolution. And I remember in the early 90s, there's this thing called process reengineering. And nobody knew what it was going to do, but it ended up with millions of jobs disrupted. Then starting in 95, it was one of the biggest growth periods in the history of the world economy, as all this talent got taken out of mundane tasks, created new businesses. I was right in the heart of that, just like we're in the heart of this now. And when you had the right attitude and you embraced it and you went out and took advantage of it, not only was lots of wealth created, not only were things better for consumers, but people were liberated to work in a new way. I'm not so sure how much we've thought about the future of work here and how we build a better way of working with all these different channels. I think that's one thing that we're missing, because the technology is never the limitation. It's always around culture and alignment between government and business and things like that.
I think, going back to your question from earlier, the one big shift we're seeing with consumers is the brand is becoming the experience, and the experience is becoming the brand. And the more those two things reinforce each other, it's going to create new opportunities for people to continue to make consumers' lives better and create better experiences for them, which in turn creates new opportunities for people to serve that. I mean, we saw, I don't know, in Nevada, we've now just licensed unmanned aerial vehicles for single people transportation. And you might see a bunch of, Uber, when Uber moves to driving its cars using artificial intelligence and self-driving cars, maybe the Uber drivers become drone pilots. I think you create a lot more opportunity. I do think one of the biggest challenges, though, in the social space is education and how we're building skills and capabilities across the spectrum, so that a whole bunch of people who are working in the hotel space or in the airline space can start to reimagine those businesses in a way to help their customers. Because going back to the point that Sebastian made earlier, if you want to leverage all of the human capital in these businesses, all of whom have amazing ideas about how to make customers' lives better, it's also about creating the tools and the culture to allow them to do this. And actually, I think today in business, where the title Ubernomics makes me think very specifically that we're valuing businesses in the traditional space very differently than businesses in the digital space. So Amazon isn't necessarily delivering the same kind of return that a Walmart is, but a Walmart's performance and growth expectations are almost the same. And I think actually that financial change for CEOs to be able to make longer term bets and have their shareholders and investors say, okay, we get where you're going, you're trying to build a business over 5 years as opposed to next quarter, I think is going to become increasingly critical.
Sebastian, what would be your take on this as chairman and chief executive officer of a big company like Accor?
Well, a bit different from those two guys. I mean,
that's why I wanted them to answer first and then go.
It's a bit different. I'm a believer that you're going to have more job being destructed into the traditional economy that you will have new jobs being created into the digital space for a time. A window of whether it is 5 years, 7 years, but it's going to be taking more time for people to create new services and new jobs than the time it's going to take to destroy existing jobs. For one big reason, which is obvious for all the major companies, is all of us, we have a very significant middle management. Of course, it depends how educated they are. But if you take a company like Accor, I have 3 buckets. I have a third of the middle management who is extremely savvy, who is understanding very well the mutation of our industry, who actually loves it, they get a kick out of it, they want to participate, and they're likely to be actors and innovators into this new field. So they're going to be in front of me. I have another third who actually understands the need for change, they understand the mutation, they would like to play a role, they don't know how. And I need to train them for them to be able to participate. They will be actors, but not innovators. But I have a last third, which is people who don't really want to see the change. They're in total denial. They don't want to adapt because they feel that they will not know how to do it. And they actually liked what they've done for the last 50 years. And I need to embark them, but I know there's going to be a resistance factor. And a third of the workforce resisting is dragging the system into some inertia. And if you talk about the private sector, which is mine, think about it into the public sector. It's probably not a third, it's probably 50%. So I'm looking for, and I have to participate into it, there's a lot of dialogue which is urgent between the chairman and CEO of big companies, because in order for me to adapt, I'm going to have to figure out what is it for me to do with the last third. I can't hold up, I can't basically drag my feet for the next couple of years until I find a solution. So we need to invent a social, economic, politics solution to make sure that that last third, we have a solution for them to feel they are participating into this new world. Don't leave them behind, but I just cannot be the only one finding the solution. So it could be a huge trauma, and no one's going to be stopping progress. I'm not even asking for any legislator to go into what's going to be happening with Uber, what's going to be happening with Airbnb, because that's nonsense. The clients want it. They love it for the good reasons. But for the old company not to die, we need to find the solution I've just been talking to you about.
Pierre, what's your take on this?
I mean, I think it's very fair. Obviously, I'm lucky in the sense that most of the employees working at Uber have joined in the past couple of years maximum. So there's definitely not that same legacy. What I would answer to your question around the impact on the job market of what's ahead of us, I think it's very difficult to have an answer for that. It's something we spend a lot of time thinking about. If you look at history, you actually see that in most of the revolutions we've seen, there's actually been more jobs created rather than kind of job destroyed. If I look at my field specifically, so the kind of urban transportation and mobility, I get very often asked about self-driving cars and what that means for the drivers you have today and stuff like that. And my answer usually is I'm quite convinced that self-driving cars is not going to be something that's going to be rolled out in a matter of a year. I think it's actually going to take a very long time for a number of reasons, production capacity, but more pragmatically the weather conditions, rain, a lot of different things. So you'll start to have certain roads where they're allowed, certain part of the city where they are not. And so therefore, I think that for a very long time, we're actually going to need the existing driver base that uses the Uber platform. That's one thing. And even more importantly, when you think about all what I've said earlier around the magnitude of the opportunity, and we're really talking about 1 billion cars suddenly moving from ownership to service. When you think about that, you're going to quickly realize that the driver base we have, when you think about numbers, is a drop in the ocean of the magnitude of the impact there. So I'm really not worried, and obviously it's something I'm thinking about a lot, but I'm not worried, or at least I'm confident in the jobs that are being created today, and I'm also fairly optimistic in the future, but I guess no one really knows.
Yes. Well, this is quite clear that this is not about killing jobs, but growing the economy as a whole. But how different environments, business environments, social environments, political environments play a role into this issue? I mean, you have experiences all over the world, and so do I. So do you. Is that a big issue? I mean, if you're trying to launch a business, I don't know, here in Europe, in France, in the US, in Asia?
What I would just stress, is for us at least, yes, it's been a big issue, and I would say our ability to actually bring all those good things I discussed are entirely tied to the regulatory framework that exists and to the ability for policymakers to actually embrace the future, embrace those innovations, as opposed to stay stuck in the sort of legacy. And I probably see too many cities or countries around the world that, as Mr. Bazin was saying, seem to have a decent share of employees not willing to think forward and really focused on protecting what exists today.
Sebastian, or Greg?
Well, I guess you have two main topics in which legislation is extremely different between countries. One, which is a hot topic today in France, which is labor content. If you want to adapt, you need agility. If you want to be agile, you need to make decisions and to be flexible. There you have a lot of legislations where labor laws are extremely rigid, which i.e. you cannot adapt and face current conditions. It's a big topic. I'm not sure we found the solutions as of yet. Second topic, which is also probably as critical as the first one, data usage. The reason why Facebook, Amazon, Google are so powerful is because they have not only access to data, but they can do a lot of push. They push info to you because they know what you've been looking for. In Europe, the data usage is very different between one country and the other, and I just cannot not only use it, but I just cannot cross-share it with somebody else. I.e., I am at least 10 years behind the US. So fix those two, and we're going to make much progress.
Very good. Greg, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, just briefly. I think it's not, in some cases, it's not just a question of the specific regulations. I mean, you look right now, if you look at all the unicorns across the world, it's still China and the US that have the largest number right now. And it's not necessarily a question of the regulations themselves. The Chinese government is very much involved in a lot of the entrepreneurial activity in China. The US government tends to let things go and then do things after the fact, but they're both relatively predictable. And that's one thing I would say is if you look at the innovation out here, if you've had a chance to even walk this floor, it's not a question of content, talent, anything like that. There's a lot to be about being predictable on that regulation. I think, especially as you go across borders in a place like Europe. And I think despite the setbacks of the past week, the fact is the greater predictability there is, the greater chance for an entrepreneur to take that risk with fuller visibility to any bumps in the road, if you know what I mean.
Well, beyond Uber and Airbnb, which are well discussed, and what future? Let's have a short glimpse into the future. What future technology do you see as having a major impact in disrupting the economy?
Maybe I'll kick off. And Sebastian talked earlier about the value of data and how he'd want somebody in Moscow to know my preferences, in France. And I think data and the proliferation of data is creating a huge amount of demand, I think, in businesses to harness both physical world data and digital data in a way that creates experiences on a kind of dynamic, real-time basis. I think today we're very far away from that. You see some amazing digital experiences. You see some amazing real-world experiences. You don't see too many experiences that connect the physical world to the digital world seamlessly. And I think there's a lot of talks we heard today and over the last couple of days around artificial intelligence and machine learning and harnessing trends. I think the ability to harness machine learning and intelligence in order to create more seamless experiences is probably the next wave. I think we're seeing a lot of amazing singular experiences, but not too many connected or integrated experiences, particularly across what I do in a hotel and what I do when I check in and book on the website and what I do when I speak to somebody at the front desk and do they recognize me? I mean, if you just think about that whole experience, how much improvement could there be and what role could data be playing in enabling those experiences is probably, it's a very short-term idea, but certainly I think one that's going to see a lot of traction.
Greg?
Yeah, I think I touched on it before, but I think robotics in general, if you look in China, which has amongst the lowest labor rates in the world, Foxconn had a factory with 110,000 people, and robotics, they're cutting nearly half of that. So robotics, in terms of manufacturing, clearly that trend is increasing. But I also think this notion of robotic process automation, where if you look at certain companies, I won't name them, but where you actually can employ robots as employees, that's a trend that I think a lot of people need to look at. The good news is it does take those things that are the menial tasks for many people. It really focuses on that. And one thing we haven't talked about, which I'll add on here, is, and actually, Sebastian, to your point, is we really need to look at this technology that's coming forth. What will be valued more once these technologies are in place? Once Uber is much more ubiquitous, what is going to be valued more? It's going to be the things that you can't embed in silicon. It's going to be the things like the human touch. It's going to be the things like creativity. It's going to be things like risk taking. We talked about banking. No computer is going to be able to make risk decisions, at least in my lifetime, which, well, let's say some of the entrepreneurs in here, because mine's shorter than theirs. So I think that, but the fact is, those things are going to, judgment cannot be embedded in silicon. So you talk about the top 30 of your workforce, those things are going to get disproportionately valued, which comes back to the notion of education, that we're really working with a public-private partnership to take these next technologies that are coming beyond Uber, are going to have even more impact on what I'd call the, the more menial tasks in the economy.
Yeah, technology is indispensable. You're going to be spending more and more every year passing in technology because you're going to need to catch up with the better technology being invented. But it's one of three pillars, and only one of the three. Because technology only works if you make good use of it, i.e. if you access data and you know basically how to use that data. The three pillars are the following. You need a good management team who understand what do they want the technology to provide in terms of information and how to use it. You need the technology to be there and to be efficient. And you need data scientists to be able to extract from the technology an answer which is being asked by the upper management. If you're missing one of the three, you're never going to get anything going for you. So at the end of the day, for me, I oversimplify things. If you look at technology and data, the world is very simple. You have 80% of the company in the world. They have data which has absolutely no substance because it is mutualized by a lot of different players, and it's not a differentiating data. So yes, it's useful, but you're never going to be creating any new business out of it. You have 16% of the company. They have data which they have real value, but they're missing one of the three pillars. They might have the wrong technologies, they don't have the data scientists, or they have the wrong management team. But if they were to find and go deep, and they have information in it to should push them to go into new ventures. And you have 4% of the companies in the world actually will have the three pillars right, which happens to be a lot of the Uber of the world. I think the hotel industry, Accor, we are in the 16% category. But I won't tell you which pillar I'm missing.
Well, gentlemen, this roundtable is fast approaching its end, but we still have say 3 minutes for a final statement or wrap up before your mics go off. Pierre, please.
Yes, thank you. I think the message I would want to pass is I know that, and I'm well placed to say that given some of the issues you've mentioned around the legal situation of Uber in many countries. I know that Uber is a company that hasn't always gotten things right when it comes to dealing with regulators, when it comes to talking publicly about what we do and stuff like that. And there's really been a change happening, 1 or 2 years ago in how we actually want to engage with cities. We are truly convinced and passionate about, all the good things that technologies like Uber and platforms like Uber can bring to cities in terms of congestion, pollution, mobility, economic opportunities, drunk driving. And we're really looking forward to partner with as many cities and governments around the world as we can to try and make that a reality. Everything has been going extremely fast, which is probably a reason or an excuse, so to speak, for some of the mistakes we've made in the past. But I think we've learned a lot along the way. At least I have certainly learned a lot along the way, and we're really excited about what's ahead.
Pierre, thank you. Greg.
Great. I'll just say 2 things. I think the first thing that's most important from my perspective, and I think consistent with all the challenges and opportunities the 4 of us have discussed, is there's never been a greater need than now for the private sector, the public governmental sector, and educators to work together to take the potential of these technologies we're talking about and plan for what this means for a whole society. I mean, I really think this is, again, harking back to the 90s and learning from that about how things changed and what was valued more. That's more than just what happens with an entrepreneur by themselves. And that does mean the entrepreneur is able to collaborate a little bit more with this smaller, larger company partnership. And the second thing is, I'd say, really look hard at who's going to disrupt the disruptors. Having been through this through a long career and looked at companies that I thought were unassailable, many of whom are still around but no longer number one, I think that's an interesting exercise to have over a bottle of wine this Saturday evening, is who's going to disrupt the disruptors, and can you play a role in that?
Nigel, please.
That's great. I think for us and the clients that we serve to help make their customers' lives better, it's a fantastic time. And it's a real privilege to have the opportunity to reimagine fundamentally how businesses can really make their customers' lives better. I also think while we think about the new and the old, a lot of businesses, our core, I'm sure, and many others, have had deep relationships with customers and a lot of trust that they now have the opportunity to leverage in order to allow them to make this transition to a new world. And I think structurally, I think there are definitely technology management teams, certainly data, but also I think regulatory and financial environments have to allow these businesses to evolve differently, like their digital competitors. And I think the opportunity is pretty tremendous.
Sebastian, you have some more time. This must be the sharing economy effect, because it's the first time in my life that I have given 3 minutes to everyone, and you haven't used the time. So
fine, I'll take 10 minutes.
This is the new environment. Please, Sebastian.
Now I have 4 words which actually guides me. The first one is curious. Be curious of your own people. Be curious of your clients and partners. And be curious of the outside world, i.e., don't lose sight of it. Try to understand what is the ecosystem in which you live in. For too many years, companies like mine, we've been only interested in our own way of conduct, totally forgetting of new invention, new product. I'll give you a small example. Before I came on board 2.5 years ago, it was an obligation for the salaries of Accor to only go to an Accor hotel when they travel. This is a huge mistake. My poor guy at Accor never ever known what was Holiday Inn or Crown Plaza or Sheraton or Hampton Inn because they weren't allowed to go there, because they were not being reimbursed. But I want each of them every single night to go to competition. That way they understand what they're doing better. Curious. Second word, doubts. You have the right to have doubts about many things because the world is extremely uncertain. You can, of course, change your mind. You have to agree to lose yourself in some occasions. Third word, purpose. The one thing which is interesting about all the startups around us, the reason why they smile is because they're actually doing something with a real purpose, because they want to change either their life or somebody else's life. It's go well, much beyond financial. The purpose is the heart of the entrepreneur, because they have an ambition, they put an objective, and they embark people with a purpose. And the fourth is enthusiasm. You're never going to be able to change your way of conduct if you don't give pleasure and enthusiasm to the people around you. If you can actually have those four words together and be clear about it and be constant on your direction, I've been saying, I know exactly where I want Accor to be in 10 years from today. I know exactly where I'm going, except I may have defined one route to go there, and I may tell you in 9 months that if I decided to take the highway, actually was not the highway to be taken. I probably should be taking an airline to go there. Or maybe I should be taking a very narrow road. I'm not going to be changing the directions, but I'm going to be changing the path, how to get there.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for sharing your insights and your wisdom, and thank you all for coming here today.